right, so I think we'll get started. We have a lot of fun stuff to cover. So my name is Ilya Grigorik. I work as a developer advocate at Google, and I focus on web performance. So the premise of this talk is, of course, making web fonts fast. And as we know, web fonts are, frankly, window dressing and overindulgence, right? Like, it's just text. We can do without it. So because this is a performance talk, really, it's pretty darn simple. I'm here to tell you that you just shouldn't use them, and we're done. Right? Like, that's it. That's pretty simple. No, I don't actually believe that. And in fact, this is a fairly popular sentiment in the performance community. I think a lot of performance people will look at web fonts and tell you that, hey, this is something that you don't really need. It slows down rendering. It does all these bad things. And that is definitely partially true. But I think it misses the larger point, which is web fonts are actually necessary because they make the web a lot better. They improve accessibility, legibility. It makes the text selectable. When was the last time you tried to kind of highlight a headline and you just realize it's an image, right? It's a frustrating experience. It also means that it's not searchable, and that means you can't search it while you're on the page. It also means that the search engines can't search it, which means we can't find your page, your visitors can't find your page. So that sucks. It's not zoomable. Which seems kind of silly, but it's actually a big deal for mobile because now you have these high-resolution devices, and web fonts just solve that problem in a beautiful way because it's a vector format. So you don't need to serve these high-resolution images, and frankly, they're just beautiful, right? Like typography and web design are like they're married together, and like anybody else, I love a nice-looking page. And when I say accessibility, right, this is not just lip service to like, oh, you didn't put an alt tag on your image. No, this is the actual experience of me taking a screenshot of a Wikipedia page yesterday. If you go to wikipedia.com and just look through a list of languages, you can find a whole bunch of these boxes where we just can't render the page. So Wikipedia actually relies on web fonts to serve their content such that it's available and accessible to the rest of the world. So their entire I guess chunks of geography which just can't render the fonts by default. So this is a good example, and web fonts fix that. Then beyond that, we already said it's selectable. That's a big thing. First of all, you can copy it, you can paste it, you can search with it, you can do other fun things, but then you can also zoom in and you get this beautiful typography right there. You didn't have to replace the image, you didn't have to do anything. And then finally, right, you could say, okay, well, we've had and we've been using web fonts for a long time, since the early days of the web. The only difference is that we've been using images, right? So it's either images or Flash replacement techniques. There's been a variety, a garden variety of techniques that we've invented along the way. So just for sake of an example, I took this one particular image and I tried to optimize it in the best way I could, and I figured that if I just use a 16-color PNG, it came out pretty clean, but it still was 14 kilobytes, right? But there's all of these downsides. So we're doing this today. By contrast, this actual font, this is a web font, is about 25 kilobytes. This is a WAV file. So yes, it is bigger, right? But it has many other benefits. First of all, it is selectable, it is zoomable, it is searchable. But further, once you have this font, you can render any text you want, right? This is not just this one image. Now that you've cached it, you can use that font to render all the text, or 10 quotes, 15 quotes, whatever you want. So that is a good thing, and you can reuse it across pages. The other thing that I think a lot of people miss is that a lot of mobile devices, Android in particular, often ship with one system font. So unless you want your website to look exactly the same, all text to look exactly the same, you have to use web fonts. We have no choice. You don't even have things like Arial or Verdana, or all of these things that you just assume are there. You just have one system font, so you have to use web fonts. And even something as simple, this is a very well optimized page by New York Times, they're actually using 3 different web fonts. They're not using a web font for their logo, they're actually serving that as an image. But if you kind of look through, you'll find that they actually have a different font for the kind of informational snippets, for the small text, and then they have their own style font for the actual headlines and the text, right? And that is the experience of New York Times. When you come to New York Times, you kind of expect a certain look and feel. You don't expect a console font or something like that. It would look weird. It doesn't conform to what we would expect. So really, all I'm saying here is it's not a question of if, because there's still, I find a lot of people have this assumption of like, do we really need web fonts? The answer is yes, we absolutely need them, and they're here to stay. So it's always been there. It's always been part of good web design and branding. This is nothing new, and our job as developers is to make them fast. So this is also not just lip service. This is not us just saying like, hey, this would be kind of cool if we had web fonts. Over the last year, the use of web fonts literally exploded over the web. We are now looking at 44% of the top 300,000 sites, as according to Alexa. This is data from HTTP Archive. They're using custom fonts. So one or more fonts, right? And this is doubled, more than doubled in the last year. So that's 44% of the websites. And then if we look at the stats for something like Google Web Fonts, right, which is a CDN, you can see that in the last year, we've had 258 billion views for Open Sans. That's a big number, right? And for something like Roboto, you see that its use has grown by 5,000%. So these numbers are exploding, right? And you can see that if you actually look at the numbers for even something like Open Sans, that's 258 billion in the last year out of 340, right? So you can see the ramp at which it's going. So this is something that we need to live with. So let's actually take a step back and talk about like what is a web font before we get into the nitty-gritty of like how do we optimize it in the browser. So first of all, a font is just a glyph. A glyph is a vector shape. So if you actually open it up and you look at the file format or what's described in there, it's basically a bunch of paths. And a font is just a collection of these glyphs. There are many different variants of the font. So when you say like, oh, I want to italicize this thing, or I want a bold version of this font, it's not just a matter of kind of applying a bolder stroke to it. It's actually a different file because it's actually a different glyph entirely. So each of the variants, a bold, an italic, and something else, and oftentimes there are many different variants of the bolds and italics and condensed and so all the rest. Each one of those is a separate font. You can think of it as a separate font. And the actual font size is then determined by the number of glyphs, right? If you look at something like Unicode, there's potentially millions of characters. So it's just how much patience the designer have to design all the different glyphs. And the complexity of the glyph. Like certainly a shape like this is more complex than like, I don't know, a number 1, right? Which would be just a simpler thing to render without any serifs or all the rest. So if you take a look at something like Open Sans, you'll actually find that different fonts have a different number of glyphs in them. Open Sans happens to have 897. You can actually find all these stats for all the fonts on Google Fonts. And it has certain subsets or character sets that you can apply. So for example, if you wanted to use Open Sans to render, I don't know, Chinese, that wouldn't work because, well, there's no Chinese glyphs. And then you need to find an appropriate font that would have those glyphs. Open Sans happens to be used by 9 million sites today. It is the most popular font on the web. And in the last year, this is for Google Web Fonts, we've had 8 billion views for it. So this is an example of a font that I think of it as almost like it's installed on your, in your cache, in your HTTP cache or web browser cache. Because if 9 million sites use it, chances are it's already sitting in the cache, right? And the way the Google Web Font serves it is actually the same URL for every single site. So if you came to my site and you opened Open Sans, which is what I use, when you go to another site that uses Open Sans, you already pull it out of the cache. So let me show you an example. So I have Google Web Fonts open here. This is a little small. So here are a number of different variants specifically for Open Sans. And this thing, if you've ever wondered, it's intentionally vague. We don't say that this is kilobytes, but this is kind of like kilobytes. So 15 stands for kilobytes. And the reason we're vague is because the actual number depends on the platform and the user agent that you use. So for example, on Windows, we serve extra hinting information to make the font render nicer, and that takes more space. So we kind of fudge all those numbers and say like, well, on average, this font is about 15 kilobytes, right? That's why it's not exact. So now if I start adding other fonts, you can see that it's basically going up in increments of 15 kilobytes, which is roughly what you would expect, right? Each one of these is serving the same number of characters. Now, another thing you can do when you customize your font is you can say, well, right now I'm only requesting the Latin character set, but maybe I have some other characters that I need to show, so I can add Latin extended, and you can see that, let me unselect these, you can see that the file size went up to 45 kilobytes. So we've added 30 kilobytes of extra glyphs. And by the way, if you go back, you can actually see all of the glyphs that are available for this particular font. And then a lot of the glyphs that are missing, right? So the X's is the stuff that is missing. So if you have some particular thing that you need to render, this is where you would go and look to see what is actually available. So it is the combination of both the number of variants that you're going to serve plus the character sets. So if you happen to be rendering Cyrillic, you can actually use Open Sans, but that'll take you to 75 kilobytes, right? So this is kind of the basic math that you need to think about. So if you actually add up all of the different variants, and this is actually a very popular thing, I think by default, a lot of designers that I know when it comes to Google Fonts, they're like, oh yeah, I need all of those things, because I need an italic and all of the different weights and all the rest, and if you add all of those up, you'll actually get about 1.2 megabytes of fonts, right? Because there's 10 different variants of different bolds and all the rest. And each one of those is a separate download as well. So the question that I would pose is, how many do you actually need? Right? Chances are you should need at most 3. There's an italic version, a bold one, and a regular one. Oftentimes you can get away with 2. And basically the fewer variants that you use, the better. And do you need the full character set? One of the more advanced features that you can also do, you saw me select the character set, you can also subset to specific characters. So you can actually say, I only want these characters. Now there's a downside to that though, because if you're too specific, then you may end up, so let's say you have a headline, and you just request the characters for that headline. The next time you have a slightly different headline with a different character, you need a new download. Right? So you have to do that kind of trade-off to say like, well, if I just download the whole thing and I'm going to be reusing, or I'm going to have different text on different pages, I'm just better off downloading the whole thing. So it doesn't make sense for me to subset aggressively. But if you're using the same, let's say the New York Times is always rendering the New York Times logo with just that one font on all the pages, sure, go ahead and subset those specific characters. So another thing that I'll add is, just for reference, the full Arial Unicode that you likely have installed on your computer is about 22 megabytes, right? So this is kind of the range of data that we're dealing with. And when we talk about optimizing web font performance, we're actually in a fairly lucky position, the English-speaking part of the world that is, because the character set is very small, right? Like we're talking about 26 characters plus a bunch of other things. For Asian languages, it's actually not uncommon to have fonts that are north of 1 megabyte, and that's like the minimal viable product for a web font, right? Because there's just so many different glyphs that you need to render. So it's a much bigger problem over there. And there's some things that we're working on to help resolve that. So the next thing you need to know is, okay, fine, we have these shapes. These shapes are then packaged into a variety of different file formats. So historically, we've started with EOT, TTF, and SVG, right? And these are just like, if you just open these up, these are basically just XML and path formats. Because of that, you can apply gzip. You must apply gzip, especially if you're serving the stuff yourself. Make sure you apply gzip, because you'll reduce the size of the font by 30 to 70%, because it's basically just text. The one difference, and where you shouldn't apply gzip, is WAF. So WAF was a new standard that came around in 2010, where we said, look, this EOT, TTF, SVG thing it's a complete mess. Different browsers need different things. Let's come up with one open web format for fonts, and that's going to be WAF. And by the way, let's just compress it right out of the gate. So that's WAF. It's already pre-compressed. You don't need to do anything. Now, the theory behind it was that it's supported by all browsers. In reality, as you know, it takes some time for all the browsers to pick it up. So I'm going to claim that WAF is supported by all modern browsers. And that's true across the board. And yes, I added an asterisk there. I don't consider Opera Mini to be a browser. It is a remote picture viewer, and a broken one at that. Because they do all of the rendering on the server side, and they actually just transfer the picture of what you're seeing. And when you click on that, they transfer the command back to the server, they run their JavaScript, and they transfer a different picture back. That is not a browser. But anyway. Yes. So another exciting thing that's been happening, this is fresh off the press. So we have WAF 2 format. So the big improvement here is we're actually getting a much better compression. So previously, we basically applied gzip compression to just all of these paths. With WAF 2, we're actually applying a specialized compressor specifically for fonts that is going to deliver a 30% improvement on average over gzip, right? So this is the reason to move forward to WAF 2. This data has been actually gathered for the Google fonts, the Google Web Fonts, and we're already in the process of deploying that and making it available. There's a bunch of other benefits, things like faster decompression speed, which is actually a big deal for large fonts, 1 megabyte and over, and also just lower file size. So we have support in Chrome 36, which means that if you open up Canary now and you actually browse to Google Web Fonts, if you look at your network waterfall, you will actually see the content type WAF 2. We're actually testing that right now. So it is available now, and you can actually run it. And as far as I can tell, Firefox Nightly should have WAF 2 support soon as well. So I think this is just a hands-down win for every browser, so I expect that others will pick it up as well pretty quickly. You can actually compress these fonts with WAF2 yourself. If you are serving them yourself, this is pretty simple. We have the compressor available. You can just download it, run it on your TTF file, and then serve it, right? So this is, and we'll actually talk about the font face declaration, how you can serve that conditionally. If you're using something like Typecake or Google Fonts, all of that is taken care of you, and that's nice and simple. There's a question back there.
Yeah, on the graph that you showed on the previous slide.
Yep.
What's the x-axis?
Yeah, sorry, this is how not to make a graph. So this is, the bottom axis that I cut off here is just basically a histogram of the Google web fonts, and it's showing you the percent savings. So you can see that majority of the fonts is in a neighborhood of 20 to 30%, but there are some fonts where the savings are up to 60%. I hope that's a little bit clearer. Yeah, so go ahead, download this. This is available today. If you're serving your own web fonts, this is something that you can do right now. Okay, so that's a little bit of just like, what is a web font? And it's good to keep that in mind. Now let's talk about the actual performance issues and problems. First of all, font face 101, right? This should be familiar to everybody here. You declare font family, you can give it a style, a font weight, and then you give it the actual variants. Like if you have it on disk, please use it. Please use the local copy on disk. Otherwise, here are my 3 different file types, right? The WAF, the TTF, and all the rest. So if you access this with an old IE browser, it'll say, hey, I understand EOT, so I'll go ahead and download that. Whereas a newer browser would just download the WAF file. Now, a slightly new, or not a slightly new, a new thing that's being worked on right now is Unicode range. So the idea here is that you'll be able to declare that this font or this file is responsible for this range of the character set. So this is important for large fonts. Think fonts that are over 1 megabyte in size. You could say, well, instead of downloading a 10 meg thing, like here's the base character set, here's the offset and all the rest. You can use this to serve specific characters. You can use this to serve a character or some range, right? None of the browsers support this today, but this is coming. I'm hoping that we'll get this into Chrome this year, and other browsers are looking at it as well. And this is particularly useful, once again, for large Unicode fonts. Okay, so that's pretty simple, right? We have our HTML, we have our style sheet, we throw in the font face in there, and we're done, right? So I'm going to claim that this actually creates a bunch of performance problems. First of all, it actually causes a minimum of a 3 RTT render, and I'm going to explain to you what that is. So let's actually walk through it, right? The first thing that happens when you request a page is, well, you request the HTML. Then we wait a while because we need to get the actual HTML. We get the response and we start building the DOM, right? So the HTML may be streaming in. At that point, we've actually find the head of your document and we discover the link tag. And we're like, hey, you're asking for a CSS file. That's fantastic. Why don't we dispatch a request for that? That's nice. So we'll dispatch the request. We finish building the DOM, or maybe the DOM or the HTML is still streaming in. Now we're blocked waiting for the CSS. And this is an important part because all rendering is blocked on CSS, right? We don't want to render a page until we have all the style information, because otherwise we'll just end up rendering unstyled DOM and then kind of flash it, which is a bad experience. So we wait, and once we have the CSS, we can actually paint the page. Now here's the problem. If you go back, or we don't have to go back, once we download the CSS, right, technically we can paint the page. We have all the style information that we need. And you just told us in the CSS file that, hey, I also need this font. So now we have a choice. Now we can say, great, we have all of the layout information, so we could paint like the outlines of the boxes, but we can't really paint the text. Or can we? I don't know. Different browsers have different decision points here, right? So there's a race in here which says there's a first paint, which is we have the HTML construct, we have the DOM and we have the CSS already, but we don't have the font. What do we do? And that creates the problem that most people are really unhappy about with web fonts. So kind of a quick recap. RTT1, so this is what I meant by 3 RTTs, right? The first RTT, and this is the best case, right? This is perfectly plausible that it takes multiple RTTs to fetch your CSS and other things. So if you've optimized everything down to like 14 kilobytes for your CSS and HTML, this is what you're going to get. You have 1 RTT to fetch the DOM, 1 for CSS, and because you have this kind of dependency graph between all 3. And then on RTT3, you get the font face. So this results in that experience, which I captured on my own page, which is the DOM and CSS almost ready, right? So I've actually painted the header of the page. I've painted the image. I've even painted some text because that text in particular happens to use a different font, which is already available. But what you don't see in here is the actual text of like the article on my blog. But conveniently, we did decide to paint the underlines of the links just to kind of tease you, right? Like this, it's so awesome. Yeah. So one question you could ask is, how long should we wait like this, right? What are we going to do? So it turns out different browsers actually have different behavior for this, and we've all kind of differed over time. And just recently in Chrome, we finally implemented or made a decision for how we're going to handle this. So we actually instrumented Chrome, and we gathered a lot of data for what is the size of the fonts being downloaded on the web today, and how long does it actually take to get those fonts. So this is kind of the summary that you see here, and what it tells you is that about 78% of all of the fonts being downloaded on the web today fall into the 10 to 50 kilobyte territory, which is pretty good, right? Like that's not that bad. All things considered. And then here you see the percentiles in terms of the actual latency. So you see that the median time to download the font is about 100 milliseconds, and then the 99th percentile is about 6 seconds, and 95th is 1.69, right? And kind of comparing all this data, what you end up seeing is for 1 megabyte fonts, it takes over 10 seconds. So our decision following that was to actually cut waiting or stop waiting for the font after 3 seconds. And what that means is that if we wait for 3 seconds, so if you end up looking at a page like this for 3 seconds, we will cancel the request, or not cancel. We will just stop waiting for the font, use a fallback font, whatever is available on your system, and render something to the screen. Previously, so this is true in stable Chrome today, M35, which is what I guess is available today. Prior to that, we would wait indefinitely. So you would have to hit escape or hit the stop button for us to cancel the request, and then hopefully the text would render. This is the same behavior as Safari as well. So moving forward, we're going to wait 3 seconds, and that's it. Now we're going to talk, so this may or may not be acceptable, right? Depending on who I talk to, they're like, you should have set this at 100 milliseconds. I don't know what you're doing. Others are like, no way, you need to wait 30 seconds. It's usually the designers, right? Because they're like, for them, getting that experience right is like, either you don't display the page at all, or you display it right. And you know what? Fine. You can have control over that, and we'll talk about how to do that later. So here's a quick summary of what happens today. So as of today, IE actually renders all web fonts with a fallback immediately. And then once the font is available, it actually repaints the text, which is a bit jarring. Some people like that, some people don't. Firefox was the first one to adopt a 3-second rule. So hold the text blank, then display the text. Chrome 35, as I said, now does the same thing. And Safari is currently still blocking this indefinitely, although I'm hoping that they will follow soon. And after talking to IE guys, I got the sense that, this is not official, but I got the sense that they're actually considering switching to the 3-second rule as well, just because the kind of the jankiness of that experience of re-rendering the text is not that great. And I think the data that we've gathered actually convinced them that it's reasonable as well. So how do we fix this actual invisible text problem? So let's look at the actual problem that we have, right? This is the same markup that we had before, right? And we said that we need 3 RTTs to render this page. And in particular, it is the gap between when we have the CSS on, when we can paint the actual page, and we have the font file where the problem lies. So we need to kind of resolve that in some way. So here's my first optimization, right? I'm going to say, screw it. I'm just going to inline the font face declaration into my HTML. How many people here think that this is going to help? One hand, one brave soul. No, 3, 2. Actually, this is a no-op. This is not going to do anything. And the reason is we still need to figure out whether we're using the font. We don't download fonts unless you actually use them on your page, which means that we need the DOM, we need the CSS on, and then we're going to see like, hey, did you actually apply this font to anywhere on your page? So if you declared 15 fonts in your file, but you only used one on the page, we'll only download one. which seems like a very clever thing to do, right? Like we've optimized it such that we only download the things that we need, but it means we have this dependency where we need to construct the CSS, we need to get the HTML, and only then do we know which files to download. So that's a bit of a problem. And for that particular reason, this actually doesn't help. Like, yes, true, we can figure out that you're going to be using a font potentially, but we can't actually dispatch the request. So really the problem becomes, how do we overwrite this behavior in the browser to say like, look, I know you're trying to be clever, but like, I really need this. Just please download it for me. So one solution to actually do that is to trick it and to say, okay, so here I'm going to just claim that I'm going to use two different files, and I know that the browser will always download the CSS, right? Because that's just another rule that we have. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to inline the actual font into my CSS. So by definition, you're eliminating that extra round trip at the end because you're going to download the CSS, and once we have all of the CSS, we don't need that extra round trip. So that's fine. That's what a lot of people do today. I think many of them don't realize that this is actually a good benefit of that. But there's some pros and cons to it. So the pro is obviously we eliminate that extra round trip. The con is we actually add more content into the render blocking tree, right? So now we can't actually have, remember how first we painted the layout and then we painted the text? Now we hold everything until we have the text and the layout. So it could actually hurt the progressive rendering experience, which may or may not be something that you like. The other cost is actually just a basic C4 overhead, right? So when you basic C4 encode something, you end up adding about 30% overhead in terms of bytes. But then you're clever and you're like, I'm going to gzip that and it's going to reduce it back to the same thing. True. But now you're double compressing these things. So if you're basic C4 encoding a WAF file, you're going to end up compressing the font, basic C4 encode, gzipping the font, and then on the other end, you're going to ungzip the font and then uncompress it again. So you're doing double the encode cost, which in the grand scheme of things, it's like my CPU is fast enough, so I don't care, but it's still overhead, and that's something that we as browser developers care a great deal about. So we want to eliminate that. So this is a practical solution to today's problem, but it is not the right long-term solution. I guess that's the answer. And now this is just the picture view comparison of to what we saw before, right? So now we're downloading both CSS files. We have to download both. They're both render blocking, and we eliminate that race between the first paint and when the text is painted. So this way you would avoid the actual invisible text. So quick summary, this is actually better if you can optimize it such that you fetch both the font and the CSS in one RTT. You could actually achieve a 2 RTT render, which is a nice win, right? And you eliminate the invisible text. But to achieve that, you need to be very careful. Once again, 14 kilobytes. I'm assuming that you're using a new TCP connection. And by the way, everything I'm describing here is like the fresh load, right? So I'm assuming that you don't have this stuff in your cache. Once it's in your cache, things get actually much easier and much better. So we're just analyzing the worst case scenario. And then finally, if you want to be really, really clever, or you have a super optimized and light site, you could actually inline, instead of having an external CSS file, you could inline the CSS with the basic C4 encoded file into your page, right? And that's a 1 RTT render. There's obviously downsides to that, right? If each page on your site then needs to inline the font, that's not a good experience. But maybe if you have a single page app and you're just kind of stuck on that one thing, that could actually be reasonable, right? That's a decision that you guys need to make. So a much better solution that's coming, and it can come soon enough, is font load events API. So this is a fairly new specification. As you can see the date, 22nd of May, 2014. Or it's not, I shouldn't say it's new. It's fresh as it's being worked on. And the idea behind it is to expose an API, a JavaScript API, for you to control how and when the fonts are loaded, to give you a say in that entire process. So here's an example. We could actually force the browser to download the font by just saying, look, I'm going to have this script block in my HTML that's going to construct a font face object. So this is a new object that's being provided by this API. It's going to be called font A, and yes, the syntax is kind of wonky, but basically we're embedding CSS syntax into here, and we're saying fetch this URL. Then we actually provide a promises-based API, which means that, hey, once this font is ready, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. We'll see some examples of that. And then finally, you just call .load, and .load says, look, I know you're trying to be clever, but I really need this font, so go ahead and download it right now. And yes, I'm actually putting the CSS in my head and above the CSS, or the link declaration. Do you guys know why? That's right. Yeah. So first of all, we want to initiate the load as soon as possible. But if we place the script block below the link tag, the script would block until we fetch the CSS. We can't execute JavaScript until we have the CSS on, which means that you actually have to put your JavaScript above your CSS. And by putting it here in the head, this will execute without any blocking. It will initiate the request for the font, and then we can start downloading all the rest. And of course, the benefit of all of this is, well, one, you have the say, or you have ultimate control, I should say, over how and when this is loaded. And further, there's no need for basic C4 hacks or any of this other kind of mess. So how this would look is basically similar, very similar to the basic C4, except we wouldn't be downloading a CSS. We would be downloading the font, and it's also not render blocking, right? You can actually dictate this behavior. And let me show you an example here. So you saw the let's create a new font face. You can actually take that font face and add it to the document.fonts, which is basically tells the browser that, yes, I'm going to be using this font on this particular page, and perhaps set a style property on it. And then in the ready handler, right, this is when the font is being downloaded, you could say, I'm going to implement behavior where the page is rendered, but the text is invisible until the font is available. This is how you would do it, right? You would grab a reference to your content, whatever that may be, and set the visibility to visible. But prior to that, it is invisible. If, on the other hand, you wanted to just render with a fallback font and then re-render it, just don't do this, right? So you have that control, and you can actually apply it selectively to certain parts of your page. Maybe some part of the page, you need to hold it because, I don't know, style or branding requirements or other things. Whereas for other content, that's okay. So I should mention that this behavior is basically available today to you if you use the web font loader library. The caveat with the web font loader library is, of course, that it's an external JavaScript file that you need to include. It's actually a pretty large, all things considered, file. It's about 7 kilobytes compressed. And that won't really help you with optimizing your critical rendering path, because now you need to fetch the JavaScript that then registers all the callbacks, and you kind of do all your stuff. And using the font loader, you can actually get this behavior that you see here. But if you need that creative control over when the font is being displayed, that is something you can apply today on your site. So just something to keep in mind. And the font loader library is a collaboration between Typekit and Google Fonts team. So it works with your own custom fonts if you're serving them off your site, plus all the major providers. So that's pretty simple. As far as the actual support for the API, the font load API, IE, I'm not sure. Safari, same thing. They don't comment on things. Firefox has a bug, and as far as I can tell, they actually have work underway to implement this, and it's actually available in Chrome Canary today, and it's shipping in the next stable release, so this summer, I guess July. So please take a look and play with it. Okay, so the quick summary of all of this stuff is make sure you audit your fonts. There are many, and I'm guilty of this myself. I actually found this on my own site as well, where I just grabbed a whole bunch of fonts, because when I was designing the page, I was like, yeah, I need the italics, and yeah, I need that, and all the rest. And then I realized that I'm using this one font for this like one little bit of text on my page, which is completely and utterly unnecessary, right? So it's a good idea to just periodically come back and revisit how many fonts are we downloading, do we need all the weights, and all the rest. Second one is optimizing font resources. So we covered some ideas on how to do that, right? Making sure that you have the right character set. Maybe you should consider subsetting those fonts. optimizing the font delivery, so obviously making sure that you have your fonts gzipped. This is actually a fairly common problem for sites that are serving their own fonts. They will download it and just throw them into their static folder, and their servers are not configured to recognize the EOT and TTF extensions as something that they should gzip, so you're just adding all these extra bytes on the wire. So if you go to something like HTML5 boilerplate configs, you'll actually see good examples of how to configure Apache, Nginx, and all the other things. And then this should go without saying, but I keep finding this problem everywhere. Make sure you specify max age or just some cache control headers such that you don't end up refetching the fonts time and time again. There are many large sites that don't do this today. It's really quite painful. And then finally, we talked about the critical rendering path, which is that number of RTTs. That's something that you need to decide in terms of what's more important to you. Do you need that creative control over being able to say when the font is being displayed? Can you just use the default behavior in the browser? Should you be using the JavaScript font loader or just default to the link tag? And see if you can optimize your actual critical rendering path. You can eliminate the unstyled text, or sorry, the invisible text. That is a problem that can be solved. And I'm going to claim that, given the API, the font load API, there's no reason to avoid using web fonts, right? I think on balance they add a lot of benefit, right? Today, a lot of sites still use image headlines. Replacing those with a web font actually reduces the size of the page significantly, and then improves readability and all the rest. So with that, we're at the end, and yeah, some questions.
If you're embedding it in CSS, you lose the ability to cross-site patches.
That's right, yeah. So when you embed something in CSS, you lose the ability to reuse the same file across different sites, right? So in some cases, for example, if you're hosting your own font, that's not an issue, right? Because that's your font. For something like Typekit, that is their way of controlling who has access to a font, right? Because you paid for that font, so that is just like a business decision. For Google Web Fonts, our idea is to allow you to reuse the font across many different sites. So that is the exact reason why we don't encode, basic-C4 encoded into that style sheet. So if you actually look at the worst case critical rendering path for Google fonts, it's actually worse, right? Because we have a CSS file that then points to the font itself, which is what I was showing there. But our bet is that for something like OpenSense, you already have it in your cache. So for the majority of sites, you'll just pull it out of your cache. And that's perhaps another decision that I should highlight. You can actually go to the Google Fonts site and look, they have a stats button. You can actually see like which are the most popular fonts. That is a design decision that you guys should take into account. Like if I'm going to use a bunch of fonts, it makes sense to use a popular font because it means that more people will have it in their cache already. And further, you can actually measure that. So I don't know if you guys have ever used the resource timing API, but you can measure if the resource is already in cache. So you can be very precise about these sorts of decisions.
What are your recommendations for localization? Should you be downloading the whole entire large character sets, or should you be trying to detect locale programmatically via JavaScript and then dynamically setting the font family?
Right, so the question is about localization. That is a tricky one because I think it really depends on your application. If you have some sort of functionality in your site which already allows you to switch between languages, I think it makes perfect sense to kind of partition those fonts. Like if, I don't know, let me make up some numbers, 5% of your visitors come from China and you need to localize it there, it doesn't make sense to serve an extra megabyte of font data for a Latin character set, right? So yes, you could either do that through JavaScript by detecting like a language or something, or chances are you already have something on your site which allows you to switch between languages, and that's where you should make that decision.
Character set. When you try to do that in the browser, is that browser relational, or can you pull back this?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
So if you're to download an italic or bold set, but it says you say it's italic or bold, is the browser doing like that based on the properties or pull back text?
Yeah. So this is dangerous territory. So the question was, if you don't download, let's say, a bold or italic for a particular font, what happens? but then you try to apply it, the bold. We actually have some like hacks and heuristics to make it look like it's bold, but it certainly doesn't give you the same fidelity or experience, and most of the time it looks kind of weird. So yes, it will look slightly different. It actually depends on the font. It depends on the complexity of the font. So I recommend that you actually download the things that you need.
Okay, so I know you guys see the fonts gives us the impression that it's going to be cacheable. Someone else has already downloaded it, kind of like jQuery and stuff. But I mean, if I'm requesting a path to 2 fonts with a couple different sizes or whatever, that's going to be a completely different URL than doesn't have these other websites are downloaded. So isn't that going to basically eliminate the opportunity for some cache?
Right, so let me show you. So this is what you're describing. So let's say you want to use Open Sans, and you have, for some reason, you want to use a 400, 300, italic, and 700. Those are the 3 variants of the font, right? So if we open that, this is what you're going to get. So this is true. So this is kind of unique to your particular site, right? But then the files in here, these files are the same for everybody.
Okay, because that's the point I want to make clear, is that this cannot be cached if I have to be patterned how I request the fonts compared.
Well, it can be cached. So right, it is cache controlled private. So it is private to your browser, to your site, but the files that are being referenced in that file or in this file here are the same for everybody else. So there's only one Open Sans 400, and that's what you're going to get. And if we were to inline the stuff in here, then you would run into that problem where we couldn't reuse the same file everywhere.
And even like this file, if I request Open Sans and then Lobster,
Yep.
the next website requests Lobster and then Open Sans.
Right.
It's not going to cache for them because they're URLs, but the files will be cached. So there's two different caching concepts going on.
Yep, that's right. And I don't remember the exact name, but yeah, you can actually do that, right? You can combine, when you go through the kind of select experience on Google Fonts, you can click many different fonts, and you get, all of the fonts listed in one CSS file, which would be particular to your site.
For WAF2, is there a separate file extension, a separate MIME type, and do clients need to support decompression? Like, what's the story with client-side support for WAF2?
Right, so 3 questions. For WAF2, is there a new MIME type? Yes, font WAF2. Is there a different extension? Good question, I'm not sure. It doesn't actually matter because the MIME type is ultimately what matters, plus sniffing the header. And what was your last question?
Client-side support.
Yes, so you definitely need client-side support because we're actually using broadly compression.
For different browsers support.
So Chrome supports it. In Canary, it'll ship in stable next release. Firefox is looking, I'm hoping that it'll show up in Firefox Nightly very soon. I'm not sure what the release cycle is there. The IE team is certainly aware of it. They don't comment on it. And same thing for Safari. But once again, within the working group, all of the vendors are there. They're all on the same phone calls. Nobody's raised any issues. It's just that some vendors don't like to comment on or make promises for when things will ship. So because you get a 30% win over all other formats, right? It's a very compelling feature. So I don't expect this to take very long in terms of actual support.
Did you ever measure the overhead of unsniffing and basic for decoding step before you use the data URLs you have some overhead? How big would that overhead be? And the usual, in a normal desktop browser, it's probably nothing.
Yeah, so I don't have exact benchmarking data. My intuition is the same. It's probably not that significant. But as I said, this is just one of those, this is a practical thing to do right now in terms of just solving this immediate problem, but ultimately it is inefficient, and that is why we want, that's only one of the reasons why font load events API makes sense. I actually encourage you guys to go and read the spec because it has a bunch of good example blocks in there, just kind of API examples. that shows you other things that you can do with the font load API.
Does the 3-second word timeout that is downloaded to web fonts also apply to the mobile versions of the application?
Right, so the question is, does the 3-second apply to mobile versions? And yes, it's consistent across, at least for Chrome. Yeah, yeah.
So I know font things you don't load if you don't use the styles, but on pitch, it's specified as a fallback.
So let me see if I understand it. So you're saying font face doesn't load if it's...
So I know that it doesn't load the font if it's not used as a
Right, okay.
I was wondering if it loads the font if the font is used as a fallback font, because that change doesn't actually run.
I see. So the question is, the font face does not load if it's not used on the page, but if that font is being used as a fallback, so if you're specifying multiple fonts, yes. So if...
Somebody actually wants to use like 2 Google fonts, one is the primary and one is the fallback. Will the fallback font file actually load?
I believe so, but I should confirm that. That is a good question. Yeah.
For the last 2 months, if I have a tab open and it's got Google Fonts, I go to another tab for a half day, a full day, come back to this tab, all the fonts are squares.
Yeah, we fixed it. Now it's round. No, so that was a bug. That was a regression in Chrome. I think that was introduced in 33 or 34. How it got through, we don't know. We didn't catch it in Canary. It's been fixed. Well, we discovered pretty quickly once it shipped, but unfortunately you can't unship something once it's shipped. So yeah, that was just a plain vanilla bug that we introduced, and it's been fixed since.
I've seen a similar thing on the Safari mobile. Like if you have multiple tabs open, like the same experience, icons just change to something that is any performance. So we thought it's because of too many tabs open, it's consuming a lot of memory. So is the performance concerns there?
That is a good question. So I'm not sure how Safari does their memory management and all the rest, but intuitively, yeah, you could think about it as we're under memory pressure, so we may evict some stuff from cache, and then when you switch tabs, maybe we need to pull something from disk or from somewhere else, and that may take a while, right? And that's why you may see that. But this is kind of me speculating at this point. Maybe another kind of semi-related thing that I'll mention is what you guys didn't see me talk about here is all the various hacks that people are using to like, oh, I'm going to load a font and stash it into local storage because browser caches don't work and all the rest. Like all of that is completely, as far as I'm concerned, is completely bogus. I think you're just creating more work for yourself. Putting stuff into local storage actually creates its own set of problems because different browsers have different ways of loading local storage. Some browsers are faster than others. So this premise that the browser cache doesn't work doesn't pan out in practice. Or if you're thinking about applying that sort of technique, first prove to me that that is in fact the case. And once you can do that, we'll have that conversation. But you know, don't go down that path until you've actually proven that that is a problem on your site.
The character set, once you render a particular font size, that's stored sort of penalty to using 15 point or 15.5 point font. You know, where there's an advantage to having several font sizes to remember your performance.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Sure. Right, so the beauty of web fonts is it's a vector format. So the actual size once you download it doesn't matter, right? You can resize the font to... Oh, sure, but that's just rendering, right? So if you change your font size, yeah, we'll have to reflow the styles on the page, recalculate layout because the text has shifted, everything has shifted. So you're going to incur that cost anyway. The font part of it, kind of scaling up the font, is not going to be the issue. It's more of just like how much of the layout do we need to invalidate to now apply that update.
It re-renders them from the vector each time.
I'm not sure I follow you. Maybe you can take that offline. Yeah.
Since we're already talking about rendering, do you have any advice for web fonts rendering across browsers and across operating systems in terms of letter spacing and
Ooh, that is a fun question. So the question is advice in terms of font rendering across different platforms, font spacing, and all the rest. So the honest answer is no. This is very platform dependent. So for something like Chrome, one of the advantages that we consider of Chrome is that we have to run on multiple platforms. So we basically have to re-implement a lot of the stuff on our own, right? So we don't rely on like the text rendering that's provided by the platform, and because we want it to be consistent. So in Chrome, you would get a consistent experience across most platforms, most.
we had problems with that in Windows.
Yeah. So that's an example of where we're actually falling back to the system rendering. And I know that that's been a long outstanding issue, and I'm hoping they'll resolve that soon. But basically it comes down to platform quirks. So it's not, as a web developer, it's not something you can really do anything about, which is unfortunate.
So in your experience, do you tend to do more bang for your buck and pressing the fonts by removing glyphs or by reducing complexity? Obviously both helps, but
What was the second one? So one is reducing glyphs?
reducing glyphs or reducing complexity of
So I've never tried to reduce the complexity of the glyph in the sense that like I've never designed a font. You don't want me designing fonts. They would be pixel fonts. Square shapes, which are easy to render and complexity is low. So practically speaking, it is a trade-off, right? Like if you get a really fancy font with lots of squigglies on the end, that is just more complex. And the file size will be larger. In practice, I find that it's usually a design decision more so than anything. Like the designer is not sitting there thinking like, "Ooh, should I use this because it's 2 kilobytes smaller?" It's like, no, it's branding requirements that I use this font. That's basically what it comes down to. And then it's a conversation between the designers and developers to say like, okay, so is this going to be used once on a page? Like, is it going to be an image that we can just render? Like for the New York Times logo, maybe that is reasonable, right? Because you just compress the heck out of that image and that's fine. Versus, are we going to be reusing this in a bunch of headlines, at which point we should make a font out of it? And that is the discussion that needs to happen, because historically we've just defaulted to the text and images, which is terrible for a variety of reasons. And the new default is like, just use a bunch of fonts, and the designers just pull in everything they can, right? Because like, I have fonts on my machine, you should be able to serve that on the web. And that's where you run into issues. That's where you need to start thinking about subsetting, localization, and other things. All right. Thank you.